say is that I'm not a trained botanist by profession, and I started talking about fern identification when I was made the education officer for the British Pteridological Society. Oh, sorry. And the other thing, the other sort of source, if you like, of my teaching, at Edge Hill University, I've used sort of similar material for teaching students, because at Edge Hill, they still teach botany. Yes. So my plan, I'm going to start, Janet said start at the beginning. So I'm going to start really with the very basics and how you decide that something is a fern. A little bit about how ferns are related to other plants. And then what you've come to hear about is fern identification. And then a little bit about how you can find out more. And as Janet said, this is being recorded, so you can go back and have a look at these things if you can't manage to take it all in at once. So the first thing is that we have to learn some new words to describe the ferns, which have fronds rather than leaves. And the stalk is a stipe, and the stem down the middle is called the rachis. The bits coming off the rachis are called pinnae. So from the word for feather, really. And the pinnae are maybe divided into pinnules. As I think, can you see my cursor, Janet?
Yes, you can.
You can. Lovely. So this is a pinna and these are pinnules. Now, ferns don't have buds. They unfurl, each frond unfurls from a crosier, and the crosiers are often covered with scales which persist on the stipe of the frond. And underneath the pinnae, often you find the sori, or each one is a sorus, and this is where the spores are made. The other thing when you're looking at a fern is to decide what sort of growth form it has. Now, I expect a lot of you will recognise our common polypody growing over a wall here. Now, this has a creeping rhizome. So the roots come out of that rhizome, but the fronds arise individually from it, as opposed to upright rhizomes. And for this, it can be the typical shuttlecock ferns, like this Dryopteris, this scaly male fern here. But this upright rhizome can also be branched, and sometimes it's quite broad and it makes a sort of tuft of fronds. So looking at the growth form is quite important. Now, as one or two people have said to me, why am I talking about ferns to the Wildflower Society? Because obviously ferns don't have flowers. They reproduce by spores. And the spores are made in the sori. In lots of ferns, there's a thing called the indusium. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to change the view so I can actually see the slide myself. I think I have to pull that up there. There we are. So this membrane that covers the sorus is called an indusium, plural indusia. But this one here, down at the bottom corner here, there's no indusium. So now each of these little bobbles is not a spore, but it's a bag full of spores. If we go on, each of those little bobbles is actually called a sporangium. And because you start off with 16 spore mother cells, which then divide twice by meiosis to reduce the number of chromosomes, you end up with 64 spores in each of those little bobbles. The sporangium is a clever structure. It has this band of cells called the annulus on here. And when the spores are mature and the annulus starts to dry out, it contracts. It pulls back until it rips open the sporangium, and then it acts like a spring and springs forwards, throwing out the spores. Ferns have been doing this for millions of years. It's a very clever mechanism, I think. And here's a spore. Often spores have quite interesting surface ornamentation that can be important. And sorry if there are groans going around on this. You might have struggled with this at school in biology, the fern life cycle. And I think this is quite important, because what happens to the spore when it's thrown out? Well, when it lands in a moist place, it grows into a completely different plant, the prothallus or gametophyte that produces the gametes. So it produces female cells and it produces male cells that actually have little flagellae on, and they have to swim in a film of water to fertilize the female. And then the new spore-producing plant grows from that gametophyte. So that's why you get a lot of ferns in damp places, because they are dependent on water. In fact, some ferns that grow in very dry places have developed a thing called apomixis. So instead of having a reduction division to produce their spores, they make spores that have the full complement of chromosomes, and then a new fern grows without fertilization. And apomixis basically means without mixing, so no sex. Anyway, there's this alternation of generations, and we rarely see these gametophytes. As soon as the sporophyte comes, it releases chemicals that actually suppress the gametophyte. So probably enough about that. The word pteridophyte and pteridological was originally applied to any vascular spore-producing plant. So the club mosses and ferns were lumped together by the Victorians, and that's where our pteridological comes from. The lower plants don't have the vascular system, so they can't grow very big. The vascular system in club mosses and ferns allowed them to grow extremely big back in the Carboniferous era, when particularly club mosses made trees, really quite tall trees. Then the higher plants, the conifers and the flowering plants here, have come much later. And just to go on a little bit about how these things are related, what we've learned since people have been looking at DNA is, in fact, these fern allies, the club mosses, known as lycophytes, are actually not closely related to ferns at all. And they last had a common ancestor about 400 million years ago. So ferns are actually much more closely related to flowering plants than they are to what was thought of as their allies, the club mosses and quillworts and so on. And the names for these groups, lycophytes for the club mosses, pteridophytes is still used, although it used to mean all of them. And another name for the fern group is Polypodiophyta. Okay, so now to get on to what you've perhaps come on for, is some tips about how to go about identifying ferns. Well, quite a lot of people in the Fern Society have been members since the 60s and 70s, but I'm a newcomer because I didn't join until 1999. And it took me a long time to learn the British native ferns. And I think the reason is that I didn't have any sort of framework, and I couldn't really work out whether these different looking things were actually the same species or not. So what I'd like to try to do is give you a sort of structure for looking at ferns so that you can use keys and make some maybe faster progress than I made. So when you're looking at a fern frond, how many times is it divided? And we'll look at that in more detail soon. We've already talked about the growth habit, and then looking at the indusia. What do they look like? What shape are they? And then another really important thing is, where is it growing? So, I mean, sort of common sense, you're unlikely to find marsh fern growing on the top of a wall. Similarly, the wall ferns are not too keen on growing in bogs. And we'll come to that a bit more later on. Now then, we have one large undivided fern, which we'll come on to in a bit. If the frond is divided once so that it has pinnae, it's called pinnate. If each pinna is divided again, it's called bipinnate. And if each of those pinnules is further divided, so that's a pinnule, and it's divided again into pinnulets, then that's tripinnate. And quite a lot of keys, the first thing it will ask you is the frond entire or pinnate? And is it bipinnate or tripinnate? And the indusia. We already looked at some what are supposed to be called kidney-shaped indusia on a Dryopteris. It's a funny-looking kidney to me. And in fact, what it is, it's a round indusium that is attached below along a radius. So it's a sort of circle with a bit of a crack in it. And James Merriweather describes them, he says they're more like little bums than kidney-shaped. So that's Dryopteris. In the same family as Dryopteris are the Polisticums, and they also have a round indusium, but it's got a point in the middle. And that's because if you think like an umbrella, it's got a point of attachment in the middle of the indusium. So if you see this round indusium with the depression in the middle, probably looking at a Polisticum. We've already looked at polypodiums that don't have an indusium. The other one that's really good to be able to spot on the Atherium, it has the J-shaped or C-shaped sori, and the indusium is the same shape, It's quite pale and membranous, and it has a fringe on its free end. So the Ethereum indusium, it's a good one to be able to recognise. Just to talk through, aspleniums always have linear indusia. But I'll let you come back to that if you want to. So what I'm going to do next is, because I think that you all know lots more ferns than you think you do, so I'm going to put up a slide with no label so you can think, yeah, I know what that is. And then I'll show you the picture with the label. And that means that when you go back to the presentation, you can just test yourself and see if you have remembered what they are. So I suspect most people recognise this, our only large undivided fern, the hart's tongue fern. In nice, lush woodlands, the fronds might get to 2 to 3 feet. But this one also grows on walls when the fronds might be 2 to 3 inches. And as it's an asplenium, it has these linear sori with these sort of flap-like indusia that go along the length. So these are immature, and these are more than mature because the spores have all been shed from these. They look black when they're just ripe. So you, I'm sure, all now know one fern, the hart's tongue fern. We have another undivided fern, although it's not that closely related to the rest of the ferns. And I think if you've seen this, I'm sure you'll recognise it. It's the adder's tongue, Ophioglossum vulgatum, often in grasslands, roadsides, comes and goes. And we don't really know very much about it, I don't think. The spores germinate underground and take an awful long time to mature. So to move on, I expect lots of you have seen this fern and know what it is on your expeditions. This is our hard fern, or Blechnum spicant. It is dimorphic, which means it's got separate fertile and vegetative fronds. So these fronds that are lying over here are the ones that photosynthesize, feed the plant, and they sort of lie out in the sun, if you will, although it often does grow in shade. But the fertile fronds are long, thin, and they can wave about in the breeze and shake their spores about. Now, we don't have many once divided ferns. The characteristics of this are that the pinny goes smaller and smaller and smaller right to the bottom, and it grows in a tuft. So if we look at one of our other very common once divided ferns, we can immediately see it's different. It's got a long stipe, and this one grows on a running rhizome. The 3 species aren't always as easy to tell apart as it seems on this picture. And sometimes you have to put some of the sporangia under the microscope to be able to tell which one you've got. And the other annoying thing is that all 3 hybridize with each other. So we have 3 different hybrids as well. But I think to start off with, if you know it's a polypodium, that's a good start. So if you're not on a limestone pavement and you've got a once divided fern, it's one of those 2. Okay, So now we're moving on to a twice divided fern, and I'm sure most of you will have seen this. It's got the kidney-shaped, oh, where's my pointer gone? There it is. It's got the kidney-shaped indusia. So this is the common male fern, Dryopteris filix mass. Now, the male is absolutely nothing to do with gender. It's called male fern because 2 centuries ago now, isn't it? In the 1800s, people thought this looked quite a masculine sort of fern, but it doesn't have a gender. As with all of the ferns, that just happens with the prothallus. And a confusing group that look quite like the male fern are the scaly male ferns. There's a lot of controversy. Stace has now put these all back into one species and called these subspecies. But Cell has actually published 8 species in this group. So I think to start with, just know that it's a scaly male fern. And how do you know that? Well, they are more scaly, they're more robust, and their pinnae are often quite leathery. I think it is possible to tell them apart. And the way that you can tell them from other male ferns is that where the midrib of the pinna joins the rachis, there's a dark spot. That's not absolute, but it's a very good rule of thumb. It usually works. So that's scaly male ferns. And another way that you can tell them apart, and this was Tony Church up on Arran worked this out. If you hold a pinna up to the light, the veins on Aphanis are really clear. They're much less clear on Borreri, and they're a bit in between on Cambrensis. That's just a whistle-stop tour of the scaly male ferns. There's an awful lot more there, I'm afraid. And our remaining male fern is Dryopteris oreades. And I think this is under-recorded. It traditionally is, well, it's thought of as growing on high mountain screes. But actually, if it grows in lowland places, and Grange in Borrowdale is one of the places I can think of, it looks very like the common male fern. So how do we tell it apart? The sori, usually not more than 6 on each pinnule. They tend to be near to the middle of the pinna. And if you get a really good magnifying glass on it, you can see that it's got these little glands, look like little pale drumsticks around the edge of the indusium. And the indusia tend to be a little bit tucked under and don't spread like in the other male fern, the common male fern. Right, so moving on. Some more twice divided ferns. These are so common in Cornwall and Devon, and they're a bit patchy really up in the north. It's a polystichum, you can see, and this is the soft shield fern. Polystichums usually have a thumb. So if you use your imagination and see that as a little sort of mitten with the thumb pointing to the left, that little thumb, that's it, yes. Jill's giving me a thumb, that's fine. So polystichums tend to have thumbs, and the soft shield fern has a little cylindrical stalk. And that distinguishes it from the hard shield fern, which is Polystichum aculeatum. I think you can see that the pinnule here, the sort of tissue just goes straight onto that midrib. There isn't that little cylindrical stalk. Also, the angles are different. This is an acute angle, whereas it's an obtuse angle there. There are some good diagrams of that about. So that's our soft shield fern and our hard shield fern. And another twice divided fern, which if you go into wet uplands, can be really, really common, is the lemon-scented fern. Typically has this rather yellowish green rachis, which can sort of set it apart from the other twice divided ferns. And it has these beautiful white hairs on the croziers, and then on the pinnules, the sori are always round the edge. I think it's a gorgeous thing. One of my favourite. Right, so moving on, we've done twice divided, and now we're into slightly more complicated territory. This one will key out whether you call it twice divided or 3 times divided in several keys. And the reason is the pinnules are divided a bit, not quite to the bottom, but in some plants it really does look as though it's 3 times divided. But we've already looked at these C-shaped or J-shaped indusia with this pale indusium, and if you get your hand lens on it, you'll see that it's got a fringed edge. So this is the lady fern, Atherium filix femina. Again, because the Victorians thought it looked pretty and lacy, and therefore it was feminine. Nothing to do with its gender. And then a very common 3 times divided fern. So you can see here that these pinnules are divided into pinnulets. It has kidney-shaped indusia again, but they're often difficult to see because they shed very early, usually in this plant, but it has these dark stripes down the middle of its scales. And this is the broad buckler fern, Dryopteris dilatata. It's ever so common. It marginally prefers acidic places, but I've seen it growing in all sorts of places. And then I'm sure you know what this is, but the number of people who've said to me, "Is bracken a fern?" Well, yes, it is, and it's a large branched fern. So whereas the other ferns we've been looking at, all the pinnae have just been coming off that central rachis, bracken is actually branched. And I think in German it's called eagle fern. And I think it could be that these look like wings. That's why it's that's where we get the aquilinum eagle. Interestingly, the new croziers have little nectaries, and these attract ants that come and feed on that nectar. They're lost once the frond is mature and leathery, but it's thought it could be a protective mechanism that if there are ants there, that animals won't eat the croziers. There's bracken. Now then, I've put these 3 up again because if you really learn these, then you'll know probably 2 or 3 ferns in almost every woodland that you go to. the male fern, the lady fern, and the broad buckler fern. So something to bear in mind. But we have some other lovely woodland ferns. The oak fern, this is the one that's on the BPS logo. Doesn't necessarily grow in oak woods. And the beech fern, which again doesn't necessarily grow in beech woods. The beech fern has it has rather fewer pinnae that most other ferns do. And if you look at it this way up, I always think that these look rather like rabbit's ears. Both these, the oak fern and the beech fern, both are on running rhizomes, so they make quite extensive clumps. And another fern that is really under-recorded, and I think most people look at it and don't see that it's different from the broad buckler fern. The narrow buckler fern grows much more upright, and the fronds point in all different directions. It doesn't actually make a shuttlecock. The other thing is that the pinnae turn themselves over to be more like a step ladder rather than being flat in the plane of the frond. And if you're not sure whether you have got the narrow buckler fern, just delve down to the base. If it's the broad buckler fern, there are these very dark scales over the croziers. And if it's the narrow buckler fern, you can see that these croziers are sort of going in all directions and don't make the neat crown that you get on the broad buckler fern. And also they're rather greenish. So that's a good way to be sure what you're looking at. So moving swiftly on, wall ferns. I'm sure you all know this character. Very common, often in urban settings. And this is a maidenhair spleenwort, has a black rachis. It's once divided, and being in a splenium, it's got these linear sori. And I think you probably recognize these as well. So this one's the wall rue. It's interesting. It's so difficult to cultivate. If it likes you, it'll come, and that's it's people have tried firing spores into walls and all sorts of things to get it to grow. Really difficult. And then this, of course, is the rusty back fern that has that lovely rusty colour on the back. Right, so another wall fern. The clue here is this black stipe. And this is the black spleenwort. So it's got the linear sori of an asplenium. Locally quite common. I think more common in the south than it is here in the north. And this is on the wall of the old railway on the main road in Earby. I was quite surprised to find. Okay, now all of those that we've just looked at on walls are growing there because they like the mortar, and they also grow in limestone habitats. So you might recognise this is South House pavement. That's Ingleborough in the background, and a token flower, some geranium sanguineum, because we look at things as well other than ferns. And the highlight, I think, if you're walking over limestone pavement, is to find the holly fern, which is also a once divided fern. And I think you might be able to see on this picture, each pinna has a little thumb. So, and it has the indusia with the spot in the middle. Another limestone specialist that is such a pretty thing, I think, is the Cystopteris. It's called bladder fern because these indusia look like little bladders, apparently. And the limestone oak fern, very similar to the ordinary oak fern, but it's not so clearly divided into three sections as the other oak fern. It's quite a glandular fern, and although it's normally quite small, I think this frond was something like 45 centimetres in length, absolutely enormous. But I think you can see that these, on this one, the lower pinny are not equal to this bit in the middle. So it is rather different from our ordinary oak fern. And another thing that I love to find, the green spleenwort, a once divided fern, very similar to the maidenhair spleenwort, but it has this green rachis. It does tend to go quite dark towards the base. And there's a bit of cystopteris growing through the middle of this picture, but hey, because one of my favourite pastimes is looking down the Grikes on a limestone pavement. So if you do get to Yorkshire, see if you can manage a visit to one. And can you spot 4 different ferns on here? So we've got the maidenhair spleenwort there, we've got some hart's tongue, we've got some green spleenwort in, and around here we've got the cystopteris. And another limestone specialist, not very common. So again, come to Yorkshire, or there are a couple of sites for it in Wales, and there's one in Derbyshire. And quite a lot of limestone ferns are fairly glandular. And this one is, if you can see how fuzzy those indusia look, that's because they're absolutely covered with tiny glands. So that's Dryopteris submontana. And the other thing that we quite often find growing in the turf near to limestone pavements are moonworts. The subject of lots of folklore of what moonworts are supposed to be able to do. And then if we have a quick look at wet places, I think most of you will know the royal fern, which is a bit different because it has its spores on these terminal parts of the frond. The spores of this are green and they don't last very long. These are brown because most of the spores have been shed. So if you want to grow royal fern from spore, you have to sow the spores within probably a week or 10 days of collecting them. And often in the marshes growing near to royal fern, you might find marsh fern. I'm concerned, certainly here, this seems to be declining, but I don't know. I obviously know the north much better than the south. Maybe you have got lots of marsh fern around. There's a massive colony at Askham Bog, which was in the news a year or two back because of possible development. There is a good colony there, so that's good. And another fern that you may or may not have come across, is it a fern? Yes, it is. It's these are rushes and other plants, but it's actually winding its way through there in the water. These long fronds do actually start as crow's ears, and the spores are carried at the base of the fronds. That's a creeping thing, which again, sadly, is in decline, although there are efforts to reintroduce it to places where it used to be in Yorkshire. It used to grow on army training grounds where they made fire breaks that filled up with water seasonally. But as they've stopped maintaining them, then the pillwort has gone. And sorry, this is showing off. This, believe it or not, is in West Yorkshire on the outskirts of Bingley. It was first discovered in a site quite close to this, the Killarney fern, in, I think, about 1725, but it was probably collected out then, and it wasn't seen from the 1770s until 2010, when it was rediscovered. And it seems to be on the increase. We found one plant the first year, 3 plants the second year, and then a dozen the next year. The last monitoring we did, there were over 20 different clumps of this. So is it because we're getting warmer or wetter? Don't know. Now, mountain ferns. Cryptogramma, lovely, mostly an upland fern, and getting higher because of temperatures increasing, probably. So I hope that it doesn't run out of space. This is just a beautiful thing. It's quite hard always to tell it from the broad buckler fern. It tends to be more divided and more lacy. Its spores are paler, and it has a very long first pinnule, lowest pinnule on the lowest pinna. But another of my favourites. And then again, if you get the chance to go up high, in Wales, in Scotland, the woodsias, really lovely. Also the subject of reintroduction programmes. There's one in Teesdale, and these are monitored because, unfortunately, the populations are probably declining. So that's a quick race round a few sorts of habitat. Here, there are some resources that you might find useful. And I think if you're starting out, James Merriweather's Field Studies Council Fern Guide is a really good place to start. It's got some good pictures at the end. The key, you have to get a bit used to it. There are several keys, and you have to decide, well, how many times divided your fern is, and also what shape it is to start with. But I think that's a really good starter book. And then James's new book is the most complete and up-to-date at the moment, with some fabulous pictures in it. So I would recommend that. For the serious who want the technical stuff, Chris Page's book from 1997, still the Bible, really. And then on our BPS website, we've got What's That Fern? And it doesn't have every fern in it, but it has the ones that you're most likely to see. The good thing about that is it doesn't matter if you drop it in a puddle or it's absolutely pouring down. It's waterproof. It's made on the paper they make yachting manuals from. So you can take it home and dry it off. £2 plus postage from the BPS website, or you can download it. So just a plug for the Pteridological Society. And the website is there. There are pages for fern identification on our website. Or if you've got a photo and you don't want to fight with websites, you can always email it to me and I'll do my best to tell you what I think it is. Now there is another, oh, sorry, there we are. There's another ID course online, Josh Stiles, who you may well know, who I have to say is an alumnus of Edge Hill University. He's done a Fern ID course, but you have to pay £5 for it, even if you're a BSBI member. And if you go to the identification page on the BPS website, there's a simple key, a dichotomous key. It's not absolutely inclusive, but it's the most common things that you find. Brilliant. Any questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Alison. While people are thinking if you've got a question, I'll just come in with my own little ones. Just a question. Are the spores in general shed from all the ferns at about the same time, or is it something that's got a different ones have different seasons, or is there a time when it's best to go IDing ferns because that's when everything's there to see?
Yes. End of July, early August, a lot of things are sporing then. That's not the case for the polypodiums often, because they come up later in the year. They often don't come up until late August, September, and so they produce their spores later. And actually in Page's book, he has diagrams to show when the fronds flush and when the spores are ripe. I wonder whether that is still accurate, because having looked at the sporing, I think it's getting earlier. The time when the spores are formed, certainly on the scaly male ferns, used to be towards the end of June, but now it seems there are some spores being made in early June. So, and the other thing is that sometimes ferns put up fronds later in the year, and then obviously the time is delayed. So you can sometimes find spores, mature spores, quite late in the year.